Domain events are a critical part of a bounded context. They provide a way to describe important activities or state changes that occur in the system. Then other parts of the domain can respond to these events in a loosely coupled manner.
In this way, the objects that are raising the events don't need to worry about the behavior that needs to occur when the event happens. And likewise, the event handling objects don't need to know where the event came from. This is similar to how repositories allow us to encapsulate all of our data access code so the rest of the domain doesn't need to know about it.
We can also use events to communicate outside of our domain, which we'll look at in just a moment.
Another thing that's worth remembering is that domain events are encapsulated as objects. This may be different from how you're used to coding events. It certainly was different for me when I first started learning about them. For example, in a user interface, events are more commonly written as some form of a delegate in another class. But here, they're first-class members of the domain model.
Right. Although you can implement domain events using techniques like the event keyword in C#, the domain events themselves should be full-fledged classes. In fact, all of these parts of domain-driven design are defined as objects in our domain model.
Von Vernon describes domain events simply, saying we should use a domain event to capture an occurrence of something that happened in the domain. The domain events should be part of our ubiquitous language. The customer or domain expert should understand what you're talking about when you say, when an appointment is confirmed, an appointment confirmed event is raised.
You may already be familiar with the idea of events from working with user interfaces. Many form-based user interface clients like VB6, .NET WinForms, and ASP.NET Web Forms, like the one shown here, make heavy use of events and event handlers. In this example, there is a single page with a single button, and in the code behind, you can see that two event handlers have been written, one to handle when the page has loaded, and one to handle when a button click event occurs. Events are helpful because they let us avoid a lot of conditional logic. Instead, we can write code that signals a certain thing has happened, and we can have other code in our system listen for these signals and take action accordingly.
So in this kind of code, you don't have a separate class for a load event or for a click event, and it may take some getting used to that now in our model, we're going to create a whole class to represent an event. Domain events offer the same advantages to our model as the events in the user interface. Rather than having to include all of the behavior that might need to occur whenever the state of one of our objects changes, instead, we can raise an event. Then we can write separate code to deal with the event, keeping the design of our model simple and helping to ensure that each of our classes has only one responsibility. Essentially, a domain event is a message, a record about something that occurred in the past, which may be of interest to other parts of our application or even other applications entirely.
In the UI, we think about the logic of our event handlers as happening in response to certain events occurring in the application. When the page has loaded, run the code in page load. When the user clicks the button, run the button click event handler. Be especially attentive to these kinds of phrases when discussing the application with your domain experts. These frequently refer to situations that are important to the domain expert, the system, or the user, and which might therefore be worth modeling as domain events. You may also discover behavior in the application that will benefit from being treated as domain events that the domain expert isn't initially aware of.
Remember that domain events represent something that happened. Since we can't generally alter history, this means they should be immutable. It's a good idea to name the event using terms from the bounded context ubiquitous language, describing clearly what occurred. If they're fired as part of a command on a domain object, be sure to use the command name. Here's some examples.
Depending on the application, it might be important to have events to represent when a user has authenticated, when an appointment has been confirmed, or when a payment has been received.
Be sure to only create events as you need them in your model. You should follow the Yagni principle. That's, you ain't gonna need it. In other words, don't create domain events unless you have some behavior that needs to occur when the event takes place and you want to decouple the behavior from its trigger. You really only need to do this when the behavior doesn't belong in the class that's triggering it. Here's some more things to keep in mind when you're creating domain events. We've already mentioned that domain events are objects, but to be more specific, each domain event should be its own class. It's also usually a good idea to note when the event took place, since frequently the code that's handling the event might run some time after the event occurred. It can be helpful to create an interface that defines the common requirements of your domain events, like this one, the iDomain event, that's capturing the date and time the event occurred.
Also, when you're designing your event, you need to think about the event-specific details you want to capture. If it's related to an entity, you might want to include the current state of the entity in the event's definition. Think about what information you would need to trigger the event again. This can provide you with the set of information that is important to this event. Similarly, you may need to know the identities of any aggregates involved in the event, even if you don't include the entire aggregate itself. This will allow event handlers to pull the information back from the system that they might require when they're handling the event. Ideally, domain event objects should be lightweight, so you want to be sure you capture sufficient information to handle the event, but not so much that the event object itself becomes bloated. Since domain events are immutable, they're typically fully instantiated via their constructors, and since they're simply noting that something has happened in the system, they don't usually have any behavior or side effects of their own.